The most powerful move you can make right now has nothing to do with working harder, making more connections, or finding the right opportunity. It is doing something that almost no one in your position is willing to do. Shutting your mouth about what you are building. Not because you are ashamed of it, not because you are uncertain, but because the moment most people hear your plan, something inside them works against it. And sometimes that something is inside you. There is a reason the wealthiest, most effective men I ever knew moved in near total silence. There is a reason Carnegie did not announce his steel empire before he had built it. There is a reason Edison did not hold press conferences about inventions that were not yet finished. And there is a reason I kept the assembly line secret from every competitor until the day it was running. The men who talked the most in my era built the least. Every single time. I watched it happen over and over again. And I want to tell you exactly why and exactly what to do instead. I am Henry Ford. I built the Ford Motor Company from a workshop behind my house on Bagley Avenue in Detroit. I built the Model T, the car that put the world on wheels. I built the moving assembly line, which changed how every manufactured thing on earth is made. I did none of this by talking about it first. I did none of it by seeking approval before I had something real to show. I did it by keeping my head down, working every day in near total silence about what I was actually building, and letting the results do the announcing when the time came. This is not a message about being secretive or paranoid. I am not telling you to trust no one and hide in the dark. I am telling you something far more precise and far more useful than that. There is a specific way that silence works as a tool for building wealth and power. There is a specific way that talking too early drains the very energy you need to finish what you started. And there are specific things you can begin doing differently, starting today, that will change how much you actually complete versus how much you simply discuss. By the end of this message, you will understand exactly why revealing your next move before it is ready almost always slows or stops it. You will understand the difference between silence that comes from fear and silence that comes from power, because those are not the same thing at all. And you will have two specific exercises you can use to rebuild the habit of moving before you speak. Listen to this every day. The man who hears this once thinks about it. The man who hears it daily starts to live it. Most people think the danger of sharing their plans is that someone will steal the idea. That is a real concern, but it is not the most common way that talking too early destroys what you are building. The most common way is far quieter and far more personal than theft. When you tell someone your plan before you have built anything, something shifts inside you. Something that was pushing you forward relaxes slightly. The dream has been given a form outside your own head. It exists now in another person's mind as well as yours. And your mind, which cannot always tell the difference between a completed action and a described intention, begins to treat it as slightly more real, slightly more done than it was before you spoke. This is not weakness. This is how the human mind works. It is the same mechanism that makes a list of tasks feel satisfying to write even before any task is completed. The writing of the list triggers a small sense of accomplishment. The telling of the plan triggers the same thing, but pointed directly at the energy that was supposed to drive the building. The consequence is subtle enough that most people never notice it. They share their plan on a Monday. They feel energized by the conversation, by the reaction, by the reality of hearing their own ideas spoken aloud. But by Wednesday, the edge is slightly softer. The drive to start is slightly less urgent. Because somewhere in the background, the mind is running a false calculation, one that says, you have already done something. You have already moved this forward. You can breathe for a moment. You cannot breathe for a moment, not at the stage where you have only a plan and no product. The urgency is the engine, and the sharing of the plan before the work is done bleeds the urgency out. I saw this happen more times than I can count, and I am going to tell you about one of them that hit close enough to home that I still think about it. In the winter of 1906, about 3 years after the Ford Motor Company began producing cars, I was working on what would eventually become the Model T. I had a clear picture in my mind of what I wanted to build. A car that any working man could afford. A car made of one standard design, simple enough to repair in a field with basic tools, cheap enough that the man who built it could save enough money to own one within a reasonable number of years. The idea was clear and specific. The technical challenges were enormous. The manufacturing problems were real. I was working on it daily, spending every hour I could spare from the operations of the company on the design and the engineering and the cost structure. And I made a mistake. Not a catastrophic one, but a real one. I talked about it at dinner, not with a competitor. With a group of men I considered allies, men connected to the company and to the industry, men who had no reason to work against me. I described the car I was building. I described what I wanted it to cost. I described what it would mean for the country if a working man could own a reliable automobile. The reaction was not negative. That is the thing about this particular mistake. The reaction was warm and enthusiastic. These men were interested. They asked good questions. They said things that made the project feel exciting and possible and real. And I drove home that night, feeling better about the Model T than I had in weeks. And then I went 3 days without working on it seriously, not because I had decided to stop, not because something urgent displaced it. The urgency had simply dropped. I had been fed something that felt like progress, and was not. The conversation had been mistaken by my own internal system for actual advancement of the project. I caught it on the 3rd day. I sat down in the workshop and I noticed that the specific forward momentum I had carried into that dinner, that sharp-edged daily hunger to solve the next problem, was softer than it had been. I thought about why, and I understood. That was the last time I described a project in any real detail before it existed. I finished the development of the Model T in near total silence. When it was ready, when the engineering was done, and the cost structure was confirmed, and the car could actually be built at the price I had been working toward, then I announced it, not before. In the years when I was moving through the Detroit business world and building relationships with men in industry and manufacturing and banking, I watched a pattern play out so consistently that it stopped surprising me. The men who talked the most about what they were going to build almost always built the least, not because they lacked the ability. Several of the most articulate and enthusiastic men I knew in those years were genuinely talented. They understood business. They understood opportunity. They could describe what they intended to create in a way that made you want to be part of it. But they were always describing. They were always in the planning stage, always about to begin, always explaining to someone new why this particular project was going to change things. The explaining had become the activity. It felt productive. It built relationships. It generated interest, and sometimes even resources. But the actual thing they were describing stayed in the future, perpetually about to begin, because the energy that should have gone into building it was going into describing it. I knew a man named Edward in those years, a sharp and genuinely capable man who moved in the same business circles as I did in the early 1900s. Edward had an idea for a specialized manufacturing operation that would have been genuinely useful and probably profitable. He had the knowledge. He had some capital behind him. He had a real opportunity. Over the course of about 2 years, I heard Edward describe this business plan at more gatherings than I can remember. Each time the description was slightly refined. Each time he had spoken to new people who had expressed interest. Each time the plan was further along in the conceptual sense, more detailed, more developed, more thoroughly explained. The business never opened. Not because the opportunity disappeared, though eventually it did because someone else built a version of it. But before that happened, Edward had simply talked about it for so long that the talking had become the project. He was building a description, not a company, and descriptions do not employ anyone, or produce revenue or compound into wealth. I am not telling you Edward's story to make you feel superior to him. I am telling it because I have never met a person who could not recognize someone they know in that story. Most of us have been Edward at least once, talking about something we were going to do until the talking became a substitute for the doing. The question is whether you are being Edward right now about something that matters. Here is the thing that most people misunderstand about staying silent while you build. They think the advantage is strategic, that silence keeps competitors from knowing what you are doing. That is true, but it is not the most important advantage. The most important advantage of silence is internal. When you do not describe your plan to anyone, the plan lives only inside you, and only in the work you are doing on it. It cannot be real to anyone else yet. The only way to make it real is to build it. So all the energy that would have gone into describing, defending, refining in conversation, and managing other people's opinions and reactions stays pointed at the actual problem in front of you. Think of it this way. A fire needs oxygen to burn. A building project needs a specific kind of daily mental energy to move forward. When you describe your project to others before it exists, you are feeding the fire to the conversation instead of to the building. The conversation burns well and produces warmth and light in the moment. But when it is over, the fire needs more oxygen. The building has not gotten any closer. The man who does not describe the project to anyone has all the oxygen going to the building every day. The urgency stays sharp because there is nothing outside the work itself to feed the sense of progress. The only way to feel progress is to make actual progress, and that daily requirement for real progress is the engine of serious building. Carnegie understood this clearly. I know he did, because he said it to me at dinner one evening in the years when we knew each other well. He said something along these lines, that the men who built real things protected the building process from the social process, that the two could not run simultaneously without the social one winning, because talking is easier and faster and more immediately rewarding than building, that the only way to keep building at the center was to make the conversation a consequence of the building rather than a companion to it. He was right. Every large thing I ever built received no announcement until after it existed. The Model T, the moving assembly line, the $5 daily wage policy. Each of those was announced on the day it was real, not the day it was planned. And each of those announcements had a force behind it that would not have been possible if I had been managing reactions to the plan during the months of building it. When the news exists, you are in a position of strength. The thing is already done. The response of others, positive or negative, cannot change what you have already built. You are announcing a fact. But when you are managing reactions to a plan, every reaction pulls at the plan. Every question requires an answer. Every doubt requires a defense. And you are spending the energy that was supposed to build the thing on the activity of protecting the idea of it. There is a version of talking too early that is even more destructive than simply sharing the plan. It is sharing the plan specifically in order to hear that it is a good one. Seeking the confirmation that you are on the right track, that the idea is sound, that the people you respect see what you see in it. This one is dangerous for a specific reason. When you get the validation you were looking for, the urgency drops even further than it does with casual sharing. Because now the mind is running an even stronger false signal. Not only has the plan been given form outside your head, it has been endorsed. Which means, to the part of your mind that cannot distinguish between actual completion and social confirmation of the plan, something close to the result has already been achieved. The approval feels like arrival, but you have not arrived anywhere. You have only been told that the destination sounds nice. I did not seek approval for the assembly line from anyone outside the small group of engineers and workers who were building it with me. I will tell you honestly that there were moments when I wanted to, when I was far enough into the development that I could see it was going to work, and I felt the excitement of that knowledge and wanted to show someone, wanted to hear that someone else also saw what I was seeing. I did not do it, not because I had no one to share it with, but because I had already learned from the Model T situation and from watching other men that the approval would cost me something I could not afford to lose: the edge, the hunger, the specific daily urgency that comes from being the only one who knows what is being built, which means being the only one responsible for making it real. Staying quiet in those months was not comfortable. It felt like carrying something heavy alone. But the thing I was carrying was mine completely, and that meant the completion of it was also mine completely. No one else's reaction could slow it or redirect it or add confusion to it. It moved at the speed I could sustain, because no external force was acting on it. I need to make a distinction here because it is important, and most discussions of this subject skip it entirely. There are two kinds of silence, and they produce very different results. The silence that comes from fear and the silence that comes from power. The silence that comes from fear is the silence of the man who does not share his plans, because he is afraid they will be judged, stolen, or used against him. This is the silence of insecurity. The man who is silent from fear is still highly conscious of what others might think. He is still running his plans through the filter of other people's potential reactions. He is still dependent on external opinion, just avoiding it rather than seeking it. This kind of silence does not produce the clarity and forward momentum I am describing. It produces anxiety and isolation. The silence that comes from power is different in every way. It is the silence of a man who does not share his plans because he understands that sharing them before they exist serves no useful purpose and actually costs him something valuable. He is not afraid of judgment. He is not hiding. He simply recognizes that the conversation about the plan belongs after the plan has been built, not before. This is the silence of a man who is completely secure in what he is doing and needs nothing from anyone else's reaction to it. How do you know which kind of silence you are practicing? Ask yourself one question. If someone you deeply respected and trusted asked you today what you were building, would you tell them? If the answer is that you would tell them willingly and with full confidence, then the reason you are not broadcasting the plan to everyone around you is from power. You simply understand that broadcasting it to everyone is not the same as telling the right person at the right moment. If the answer is that even with someone you completely trusted, you would still feel uncomfortable describing what you are building, then you may be practicing fear-based silence. And that is a different problem. Fear-based silence points to unexamined doubt about the project itself, which needs to be addressed directly rather than protected by not talking. The practice I am describing throughout this message is power-based silence. The deliberate, confident choice to keep the building process separate from the social process. Not because you are afraid of what people will say, because you know exactly what you are doing and you do not need them to know it yet. In the spring of 1913, when the moving assembly line was being developed at Highland Park, I was aware that several other automobile manufacturers were watching what we were doing with genuine interest. The production volumes at Highland Park were already drawing attention. Our costs were coming down in ways that our competitors found difficult to explain because the full nature of what we were building was not yet visible from the outside. At some point in that period, a man who was connected to one of our largest competitors asked me directly at a social gathering what we were doing differently at the plant. He was a pleasant man. The question seemed casual, and for a moment, I almost answered it honestly. I caught myself, not because I had a rule about it, because in the half second before I would have answered, something clicked. The answer I was about to give would have been accurate and specific, and several months premature. What I was about to describe was not yet finished. It was not yet fully proven. And the moment I described it to this man who would carry it back to his employer, the advantage I had been building would be cut in half. I gave him a general answer about continuous improvement in the production process and moved to a different part of the room. The moving assembly line was announced to the world when it was operational, not before. And the gap between what our competitors understood and what we had actually built was large enough that by the time they understood what they were dealing with, we had already moved further ahead. That gap was protected by silence during the months of construction. Every month of silence had been a month of compound advantage. The cost of that near mistake, the one I almost made at that social gathering, would have been impossible to calculate, but I know it would have been significant, and I came within a sentence of paying it. Here is the first exercise. It is specific, and it works if you actually do it. Take a piece of paper right now, or tomorrow morning before you speak to anyone. Write down the one most important thing you are currently trying to build. The business, the savings, the project, the skill, the single most important forward direction in your life right now. Write it on the paper. Now write the names of every person you have told about this thing, everyone who knows about it, everyone who has heard your plan for it, or your intentions around it. Then, for each person on the list, write a one-sentence honest answer to this question. Why did I tell this person? Was it because their specific knowledge or capability was genuinely needed for the project? Or was it because I wanted them to know, because I wanted their reaction, because I wanted to feel, in some small way, that the project was more real by existing in another person's mind? Be completely honest. This is not a judgment. It is a diagnostic. What you will find in most cases is that a large portion of the people who know about your current most important goal know about it because you wanted the social experience of sharing it, not because they needed to know, not because telling them advanced the project in any concrete way, simply because telling someone about something you are excited about feels good. That feeling is real. It is also expensive. Every person who now knows about the project before it exists is a potential source of friction on it, not necessarily because they mean harm. Because other people's knowledge of your unfinished work creates weight. They ask about it. They have opinions. They track your progress, which means your progress is now being tracked by people whose evaluation of it you care about. That tracking changes how you experience the work. It adds a performance dimension to something that should be purely functional. The second part of the exercise is this. For the next 30 days, tell no one new about this project. No one. Work on it every day in the same daily system I described in the previous message, your 3 small, specific morning actions. But tell no one. Let the project exist only in your work on it and in the minds of the people already on your list. At the end of 30 days, look at what has happened, both to the project and to your experience of working on it. Most people who do this honestly report that the work feels different within a week. The performance dimension drops away. The daily work becomes purely about the problem in front of you, rather than about how the work looks to others or whether you are living up to what you said you would do. The work gets quieter and sharper at the same time. That is what building in silence feels like. It is not lonely. It is focused in a way that talking while building rarely produces. There is another dimension to this that took me some years to fully appreciate. Moving in silence does not just protect your projects and conserve your building energy. Over time, it changes how the people around you experience you. The man who announces his plans before he has built them, who tells everyone what he is working on and what it will become, trains the people around him to wait for announcements rather than look for results. When such a man eventually delivers something real, the response is proportional to the gap between the announcement and the delivery. If the delivery matches the announcement, people are satisfied. If it falls short, the disappointment is compounded by the gap between what was promised and what arrived. The man who moves in silence and delivers results without prior announcement creates a completely different effect. The result lands with its full weight. There is no prior announcement for the result to be measured against. There is only the result itself, and because the result was not expected, because there was no warning, it lands with a force that even an equivalent result from the announcing man cannot match. I have seen this play out many times in business contexts. 2 men deliver equivalent results. One announced his intention months before, and the delivery is judged against the announcement. The other said nothing until the delivery arrived. The man who said nothing receives more credit for the same work, not because anyone is consciously giving him extra credit, but because the unexpectedness of the delivery amplifies its impact. Beyond individual moments, the accumulation of this pattern builds a specific kind of reputation, the reputation of a man who does not speak without evidence behind the words. When such a man does speak, people lean in, because they have learned through experience that his words are followed closely by results. His silence had trained them to take his rare statements seriously. Harvey Firestone told me once that when I spoke at industry gatherings, which I did rarely, the room changed. Men who had been talking stopped. Not because my ideas were so dramatically superior to those of other men, but because I had built a record of saying things that subsequently happened. The silence in between the statements was what gave the statements weight. That is a form of power that cannot be manufactured or performed. It can only be built, slowly, through the consistent practice of delivering before announcing. Every time you keep quiet about something you are building and then deliver it, you add another layer to that reputation. Every time you announce something you subsequently cannot deliver, or deliver at a reduced level, you take a layer away. The 5% of people who understand this begin to manage their public words the way they manage their finances, as a resource that compounds when handled carefully and depletes quickly when spent carelessly. There is a specific version of talking too much that I want to address separately because it is the one that costs the most and that the most people have never identified as a problem. It is explaining yourself. Not your plans, not your goals, but your decisions. The choices you have already made, the directions you have already chosen, the reasoning behind actions you have already taken. Most people explain themselves constantly. Someone questions a decision and they respond with a defense. Someone expresses doubt about a direction they have chosen and they try to convert the doubter with explanation. Someone misunderstands their motivation and they feel compelled to correct the misunderstanding with a thorough account of what they were actually thinking. Every one of these explanations costs something, not because the other person does not deserve to understand you, but because the act of explaining a decision you have already made is, in a quiet way, suggesting that the decision is still open, that it could be unmade by a sufficiently compelling counter-argument, that you are still available to be redirected. The man who has truly made a decision and is committed to it does not explain it. He simply moves. The question, "Why are you doing it that way?" receives the answer, "Because that is the way I have decided to do it," rather than a lengthy defense of the methodology, not because the man is arrogant or dismissive, but because he understands that the decision belongs to him and that defending it to people who are not responsible for executing it is a use of energy that serves no real purpose. This was a lesson that cost me real time to learn, and I want to be honest about that. In the earlier years of building the company, I explained myself far more than I should have. Every time a partner or investor or supplier questioned a direction, I felt the pull to justify it thoroughly, to demonstrate through argument that the decision was correct. And those arguments, even when I won them, consumed hours that belonged to the work of actually building the company. The turning point came when I recognized something that sounds obvious but was genuinely useful to understand clearly. Nobody who doubts your decision will be fully convinced by your explanation. If they were the kind of person who would be convinced by your argument, they would have seen the logic before expressing the doubt. The explanation is not for them. It is for you to manage the discomfort of being questioned. When I stopped managing that discomfort through explanation and started sitting with it as a natural consequence of moving in my own direction, the forward motion of the company accelerated. Not because fewer people doubted my decisions, but because I stopped spending time defending decisions that were already made and started spending that time advancing them. The practical application is this: the next time someone questions a decision you have already made, resist the pull to defend it in detail. Say something brief and factual and move on. That is how I have decided to approach it, is a complete sentence. The question of whether they agree with you is not a question you need to resolve. They do not have to agree with you. They only have to accept that you have decided. There was a man who worked with me at a certain point in the early years of the company, a man named George, who had done well enough in manufacturing to have some capital behind him and a genuine desire to build something of his own. He was quiet by nature, not in a withdrawn way, but in the way of a man who was always thinking before speaking. George had observed the same pattern I have been describing, though he arrived at the understanding of it through his own experience rather than through any formal study of it. He had watched other men talk extensively about things they were going to build and then fail to build them, often enough that he had drawn a personal conclusion. The talking and the not building were connected. When he decided to build his own manufacturing operation, he told no one for 4 months. He worked on the planning, the cost structure, the supplier relationships, the layout of the facility, all of it, without describing any of it to anyone outside the smallest necessary circle. He acquired the property. He ordered the initial equipment. He hired the first workers. He did all of this in a state of near complete silence about the larger intention behind it. When he was ready to begin operating, he announced the business to the people who needed to know: customers, suppliers, the broader business community. The announcement was received with something between surprise and respect. Not surprise that he had been able to do it. surprised that it had been done at all, without most people being aware it was happening. George told me later that the 4 months of silence had been the most productive 4 months of his professional life. That every piece of the operation, when he looked back at it, was better for having been built quietly, that the decisions had been cleaner because no one was asking him to justify each one as it was made, that the momentum had been stronger because there was no social component draining it, that when problems arose, which they always do, they were solved without the additional weight of being visible to people who were watching to see if the thing was going to work. The business George built ran for decades and employed hundreds of people. The silence of those first 4 months had almost nothing to do with keeping competitors from knowing about it. It had everything to do with allowing the building process to run at its full strength without the friction that external awareness introduces. There is one more dimension to the practice of moving in silence that I find worth describing because it surprised me when I first understood it. People are drawn to what they cannot fully see. The man who explains himself constantly, who describes his plans in detail, who makes his reasoning fully transparent at every step, gives the people around him a complete picture. They know what he is doing and why. They have no remaining curiosity about him because he has answered every question before it was asked. He is, in a sense, completely legible. The man who moves in silence, who delivers results without prior announcement, who does not explain his reasoning for every decision, is not fully legible to the people around him. They can see what he has produced. They cannot entirely understand how or why or what is coming next, and that partial visibility creates a specific pull. They pay closer attention. They give more weight to the things he does say. They treat him as someone worth watching because they cannot predict what he will do next. This is not about being mysterious for the sake of it. It is a natural consequence of the practice I have been describing. When you do not pre-announce your moves, when you let the result carry the information rather than the description, you are simply more interesting to the people around you than the man who narrates every step in advance. I noticed this effect in my own experience, and I noticed it in the men I most respected. Carnegie was difficult to predict. Not because he was erratic, but because he rarely described what he was thinking about building next. You could observe his actions and sometimes infer his direction. But you could not fully read him from his words alone because he was careful about which words he made available. That quality made every room he entered pay attention in a way that fully transparent men rarely commanded. This is not a technique. You cannot fake it. It is the natural byproduct of a man who has genuinely internalized the practice of building before speaking, who has trained himself to let the work carry the weight rather than the description of the work, and who, as a result, has words that are rare enough to be noticed when they appear. The most common objection I hear when I describe this practice is a practical one. What do you say when people ask what you are working on? It is a real question, and it deserves a real answer. The answer is not dishonesty. I am not suggesting you lie or pretend to have no direction. I am suggesting you give true answers at the level of generality that serves the project rather than the level of specificity that serves the conversation. When someone asked me what I was working on during the development of the assembly line, I told them we were working on improving our production processes. That was completely true. It described what was happening without describing what specifically was being built or how. The questioner received an honest answer. The project received protection from the specific kind of premature exposure that would have cost us real advantage. You can always answer genuinely and at a level of generality that keeps the specific work intact. Working on something I think will be useful is true. Building something in the manufacturing space is true. Focused on improving the efficiency of what we do is true. None of these require you to lie, and none of them require you to describe the thing before it is ready to be described. There is also a second kind of answer that is available to you, and it is even simpler. I will show you when it is ready. That sentence closes the question completely and creates anticipation rather than managing reaction. The person who hears it now knows something is coming and does not know what. That is a better position for you and, in a way, a more interesting position for them than a detailed explanation would have created. The only situation in which genuine detail is required is when the person you are speaking to has a direct role in the project. suppliers, partners, workers who need to execute specific tasks. In those cases, the detail serves the building and is worth giving. Everyone else receives the general truth and the promise of more when the time is right. Everything I have described in this message points toward a single underlying principle that is worth stating plainly, because once you see it, everything else becomes obvious. The work and the discussion of the work are not the same activity and cannot be run simultaneously without the discussion winning. Discussion is easier, it is faster, it is more immediately socially rewarding. It produces the sensation of progress without the labor of progress. And because it produces that sensation, the mind will always choose it over the labor if both are available. The only way to ensure that the labor happens is to make the discussion unavailable until the labor is complete, not permanently, not out of antisocial intent, but as a disciplined structural choice about which comes first. Build, then announce. Deliver, then discuss. Move, then speak. In that sequence, everything you build has the full force of your undivided energy behind it. In any other sequence, the energy is always being shared between the building and the performance of building for an audience. I have run businesses that I announced before I built them. They did not perform as well as the businesses I built before I announced them. The difference was not talent or timing or capital. It was the quality of the building process. A building process that is also a performance is slower, noisier, and more prone to outside influence than a building process that runs entirely in private. This is the real reason the 1% moves the way it does. Not to protect secrets from competitors, though that matters. Not to appear mysterious, though that is a real consequence. But because the men who have built the most, who have compounded the most, who have delivered the most consistently, have understood through hard experience that the building process must be protected from the social process, or the social process will consume it. Always, without fail, every time. Here is the second exercise. This one is about auditing the talking you have already done and understanding its cost. Write a list of everything you have told other people you are going to do in the past 12 months. Every goal, every plan, every stated intention. Write them all. Now mark each one. Did it happen? Is it underway? Or is it still only a description? For the ones that are still only descriptions, ask a specific question. When did I tell the most people about this? Was the most talking happening in the early phase when the energy was highest? Or did the talking happen steadily through the whole period? What you will find, in almost every case, is that the items still only in description form received the most social energy in the early phase. The excitement of the new idea was shared most enthusiastically at the beginning, when the project was most fragile, when the urgency was highest, and most easily drained by the premature social experience of it. The items that actually got built, in contrast, probably received much less social energy in the early phase, either because you intuitively protected them or because they were less dramatic and therefore generated less conversational interest, which paradoxically meant the energy stayed pointed at the work. The pattern you will find in this list is not a judgment of your character. It is a map of where your energy has been going. Use it as a diagnostic to understand what you want to do differently with the project that matters most right now. Then, make a specific commitment about that project. Define what done looks like. Define the day when announcing it will be appropriate. And between now and that day, let no new person hear about it. No exceptions. Every morning you work on it in the daily system, the 3 specific small actions, and then you go about the rest of your day as a man who is building something but cannot tell you what it is yet. That discipline, held for a month, changes the project. It changes you. And when the announcement day comes and you are describing a thing that already exists, a thing you built without anyone watching, you will feel the difference between that conversation and every description before delivery conversation you have had before. One evening in the years when Carnegie and I knew each other well, we were at dinner with a small group of men from various industries. The conversation turned at some point to a man who was not at the table, a well-known figure in the business world, who had been making grand announcements about his next venture for some months without yet showing any concrete progress. Carnegie listened to the conversation for a while without commenting. Then he said something I have quoted many times since because it was precise enough to be immediately useful. He said that there are men who build and men who announce, and that the two populations have almost no overlap. That, in his observation, the drive to announce and the drive to build come from fundamentally different places in a man's character. The drive to announce comes from needing external confirmation that the project is real. The drive to build comes from needing the project itself to be real. That the first kind of man will always be more comfortable in a room than in a workshop. And that the second kind of man, when he does appear in a room, commands it differently than the first, because what he is carrying into the room is already done. Then he looked around the table and said, in a way that was quietly pointed without being unkind, that every man present who had something real to build would benefit from fewer dinners and more workshops until the thing was finished. He said it with a slight smile, but nobody laughed, because everyone at that table recognized it was true. I want to bring all of this together in a way that makes the underlying mechanism clear, because the practice of moving in silence is not just a tactic, it is a fundamental understanding of how building actually works that, once you have it, changes every project you run from that point forward. Every time you choose to do the work before describing it, you are doing two things simultaneously. You are advancing the project, and you are training yourself to find the reward in the work rather than the discussion of the work. That second thing is the more important one in the long run. Most people spend their lives needing external markers to feel like they are on the right track. They need reactions and feedback and validation and the sense that other people see what they see. That need is normal. But it is expensive because it means that your experience of your own progress is always mediated by other people's responses to it. You feel good when they respond well. You feel doubt when they respond skeptically. Your inner experience of your own direction is dependent on external weather. The man who builds in silence for long enough, who learns to find the reward in the daily work itself rather than in the social experience of describing it, develops something that the validation-seeking man cannot access. He develops an internal compass that reads the progress of the work directly, without the noise of external reactions distorting the reading. That internal compass is what allows a man to stay on course during the long months when nothing visible has happened, and the external world cannot tell you whether you are on the right track. You cannot ask it. You have not told it what you are building. The only feedback available is from the work itself. And learning to read that feedback, to understand what the work is telling you about whether you are moving in the right direction, is a skill that only silence builds. This is the deepest reason the men I most respected moved quietly, not because they were hiding, because they had trained themselves to work from an internal compass rather than an external one. And that compass, once developed, makes them practically impossible to stop, because there is no external input they depend on, no approval they are waiting for, no reaction they need before the next action is taken. They simply move, every day, directed by their own reading of the work and nothing else. That is the true power behind staying silent, not the strategic advantage of keeping competitors in the dark. The internal development of a man who has learned to build from the inside out. Let me close by giving you the three most practical things to take from everything I have said. The first is the understanding that the feeling of progress you get from describing your plans is not real progress. It is a sensation of progress that costs you real building energy. Every time you choose to do the work instead of describe it, you are making a transaction in favor of the actual result rather than the feeling of it. That transaction, made consistently, compounds. The second is the distinction between silence from fear and silence from power. Check yourself honestly. If you are quiet about your project because you are afraid of judgment, that is not the silence I am describing, and it will not produce the results I am describing. Work on the doubt directly. Examine it the way I described in the previous message, on paper, honestly. The silence you want is the silence of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and does not need anyone else to know it yet. The third is the practice itself. Do the two exercises. 30 days of telling no one new. the audit of what you have announced versus what you have built. Let those two exercises reveal the pattern in your own behavior, and then make a specific commitment about your most important current project. Build before you announce. Move before you speak. Deliver before you describe. The man who does this consistently, who trains himself over months and years to let results carry the announcement rather than descriptions carry the hope, becomes a different kind of man than the one who narrates his own journey while still in the middle of it. Quieter, less immediately visible. But when he does appear with something complete, with something real, with something that cannot be argued with because it already exists, the weight of it lands in a way that years of announcements could not have produced. Listen to this message again tomorrow, and the day after. Each time you come back to it, the part that is most relevant to what you are currently building will be clearer. That is how this kind of instruction works. The words do not change. Your position changes. And from each new position, a different part of the message becomes immediately useful. The world does not reward the men who talked about what they were going to build. It rewards the men who built it without saying a word. Begin being that man today, not when the time feels right. Today.